So again, an artifact that speaks tremendously about social organization at this time and the shifts that are taking place. These early hayloft stamp seals tend to be just these geometric shapes. We're going to see them change and grow and become incredibly complex a bit later on. So first stamp seals during this period. There are some earlier examples in Samar and Hassuna, but they're not widely used. In the hayloft period, then later in the Ubaid, as we'll see, sealing and this idea of centralized bureaucracy becomes very, very important. We also see beads, amulets, these clay figurines are very common, these hayloft-style figurines. We've seen something like this before. Where else have we seen something like this before? If you had to compare this, say, on a midterm exam with another piece that maybe I showed you a little bit earlier on. Yeah?
The catalog.
Exactly, right? Yeah, the same sort of stylized, very voluptuous, you see the legs and the arms, style figurine. Again, this coming much, much later, on upwards of 500 years to 1,000 years later. The late hayloft is replaced, I'm sorry, I'm moving ahead of myself. Another thing about the hayloft period that's very, very striking is its pottery. And you can see here the degree of technical expertise that goes into designing something like this. Again, we're talking about a period of 1,000 years in which pottery has really, since 7,000, now we're in 5,500. So that's 1,500 years of time to perfect your art, and that's a lot of time. But this is very, very fine stuff. It's actually fired in what's called a double kiln, which allows you to control temperatures a bit better. And you can see it's what's called polychrome pottery. It's our first examples of polychrome pottery, in which multiple colors are used. We have these beautiful reds and whites, browns and blacks. And this picture is terrible, but you can see a bit of a shine. It's highly burnished, giving a beautiful, beautiful reflective surface. These concentric, wonderful patterns upon it. A number of these pieces have been analyzed. The clay has been sourced, or it's been attempted to be sourced. You can zap this with, say, like we're talking about EDXRF, the material that you could learn yourself over at the ARF. And the composition of these pieces seems to indicate that they're being made in the same place and being traded widely across North Syria and southern Anatolia. They're being manufactured in specific centers, but not in South Mesopotamia, actually. We don't see them there. They're being traded from the north down to the south. And this is a shift, right? We've looked at the emergence of craft production, but mostly we've seen it at the household level. Now we're seeing the first step towards institutionalization, almost mass production and industry that will later mark Mesopotamian urban development. So this is quite important as well. We're seeing this shift. And actually, when we get to Uruk next time, we'll see some very interesting developments with mass production and pottery and some surprises along the way. But before we get there, we'll move on to the last, the fourth and final period or culture that we'll be looking at for the pottery Neolithic. And this is known as Ubaid, the Ubaid culture. And this emerges primarily in the south and then spreads to the north. We're looking at a period from about 5,500 to around 4,000 BCE. And again, like these other sites, it's named after the site in which pottery was first found, and that's Tel al-Ubaid. But like these other sites, there are other sites that probably were more important and certainly are a little more representative of the traits of architecture and art and practice that typify this period and this culture. The best site in this case is Eridu. The modern name of Eridu is Tel Abu Shahrain. It's far in the south, and Eridu is a tremendously important site for a number of reasons. It's inhabited very, very early on, from around 5,500. Actually, there are even earlier periods of occupation for the site. And if you remember this from before, we can see that during the Ubaid period, in fact, starting all the way down here at level 16, right, and we're talking about stratification, right? All these pieces, this is just superimposed so you can see everything is supposed to be on top of everything else, but it's, of course, extended out. 16 levels of occupation just in this temple sequence that runs from 5,500 in the Ubaid 1 all the way to 2000 BCE, much later on, which we'll be looking at. We find at this site a very primitive chapel down at the bottom. And the site's incredibly important because not only do we see archaeologically that it's one of the earliest temples and earliest sites that we have, but also in Mesopotamian mythology, Eridu is an incredibly important place. You can read in some of the creation epics that Eridu is said to have been the first city ever made, and actually you can see a little snippet of it. This is also in Rofe, you can check it out. A reed had not come forth, a tree had not been created, a house had not been made, a city had not been made, and then Eridu was made. The home of the god Enki, and Enki will be encountering many times as we sort of see the development, especially of these cities in southern Mesopotamia. You can see Eridu is well placed. It's actually on the Euphrates, would have had access to water and resources, and most likely was much closer to the Persian Gulf than we see today. Over thousands of years, these rivers silted up and pushed the coastline back again. We talked about how rising water levels pushed it in. Over time, it's been pushed back with the deposition of silts. So Eridu was probably much closer to the sea at this time, allowing the people that lived there to have access to a number of different resources in terms of fish, in terms of trade and whatnot. The site itself is fascinating. The temple there is very interesting. This is Ubaid level 16. Eridu level 16, which dates to the Ubaid 1. And in it we see this very interesting structure, this tiny little structure which has some very interesting attributes. And those are, right off the bat, a niche, the sort of inside, this niche which is in the back of the structure, and a small raised platform or altar, and then in the center of it, an offering table. And we believe this was an offering table because actually there was ash and the deposition of lots and lots of fish bones, which are actually later known to be sacred to the god Enki. So it seems as though the practices of this period are very similar to what we know from later on, what this place was. And this is happening at a very, very early period, at 5,500 BC. So those structures, they're very interesting and very seminal for a number of reasons, because later on, for example, as we move from level 16 to almost 1,000 years later, many levels in between, right? But from level 16 to level 8, the interim levels are much, you can see them here, they're very jumbled and very difficult to sort of untangle. But from level 16 to level 8, which spans the Ubaid period. This is Ubaid 1 and Ubaid 4, from around 5,500 to 4,500. We see continuity in structure, right? This is, again, a temple and has a whole bunch of new attributes that are really interesting, which we'll look at, but the main facets are still there. We've got an altar, which is in axial. It's laid out on a central axis with an offering table. So those basic forms, which began in the early Ubaid, continue into the late Ubaid, almost 1,000 years later, and will continue, as we'll see later in the semester. There's some new developments too that occur later in the Ubaid with, say, level 8 here. We see that in addition to the altar and the offering table, a series of rooms have been put on both sides of this central axis on the temple. So this is actually called a tripartite plan, which essentially just means a three-room plan or a three-segment plan. So we have these tripartite temples, and very similarly to what we saw at Tel Es-Suwan much earlier, you can see that the decoration, the outside of this temple, is again niched. It has these stylized niches, which at this point you can see don't really have much structural support. They don't really have a function other than decoration. And you can imagine what this would have looked like, right, with the sun hitting it, coming at an angle. Instead of just having a flat wall, now all of a sudden you have texture, you have light and shadow that changes over time. It makes the temple a dynamic place as opposed to just sort of a static place. And of course, right, this is the house of a god. These tripartite tripartite temples are also mirrored in the domestic architecture during this time. Tel Madhur, for example, we see tripartite houses, the division of different areas, perhaps for different people and different activities to take place. So the same is true for these temples. Pottery from the Ubaid period. Here again is this plan from Eridu. Examples of Ubaid pottery, again, we're finding that they are somewhat mass-produced, but ever increasingly distributed. During the Ubaid period, we find these in a wide variety of sites, and it's very, very telling that this is really a trait of attributes that is really a culture, right? People are building in the same way. They're using pottery the same way. They're burying their dead in the same way over a vast area. I'll get to those guys in a second. You can see that unlike the Hayloft pottery, this pottery is now a little bit less, let's say, attractive. The burnishing is non-existent. It's just sort of hand-painted and much more utilitarian. And we see the shift away from pottery as it becomes mass-produced and much more accessible. It becomes much less of a luxury good. It's now more common. And along with that, during the Ubaid period, more say luxury goods are being imported. We see lapis lazuli being imported from Afghanistan during this time, used, of course, for its brilliant blue color. These rarities, the idea of luxury goods are starting to take off, but not so much in pottery now that it's becoming common. Also during the Ubaid, we see these very interesting figurines. And much has been said about these. These date to the Ubaid IV, from around 4500 to 4000 BCE. They're called lizard figurines, or lizard-headed figurines, obviously because they look a little reptilian. Any of you ever see Ancient Aliens on the Discovery Channel? Okay, so you probably saw these guys at one point because they, especially this guy looks very, I guess, alien-esque. They're very odd. They're very strange. They're sexed, again, like some of the earlier figurines we saw. These ones have breasts and a pubic triangle. Obviously, this guy has a penis, so he's male. And it's very interesting. They have these pellets of clay which are pressed on before these figurines are fired, and it's really unclear what they are. Some theories go that they were it was scarification, that the people during the Ubaid were actually decorating their skin by scarring themselves, which we know many cultures